Three, two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, a researcher. His name is John Brisson, and he has been researching this very strange cult case that's referred to as the Finders case. It's a group that actually had they almost avoided being named, but they came a name that has been applied to them is known as the Finders, and it really came to the public attention after an arrest that took place in Tallahassee, Florida in 1987, where two men were found with 6 children who had bug bites. They were oblivious to modern technology and seemed to be operating with these kind of rewards. But it really started off an investigation, and John can tell us more about that. John, are you there?
Yes, I am, William. Thank you for having me on. I'm a huge fan of your show.
Oh, thanks.
I have not read your book yet on the West Memphis Free, but I definitely am going to get a copy of it.
Well, that's an interesting ride. That's one that maybe is a lot like this case, where you kind of start peeling back the onion, and there's many, many, many layers. It gets deeper and deeper. But, this case is much like that. It started off with this one kind of arrest that took place with 2 men were arrested, and it just led down multi-state jurisdiction back to D.C., back to rural Virginia. But maybe you can start off and tell the listeners a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the subject, and then how this arrest led to the discovery of this strange group.
Yeah, my name is John Brisson. I'm actually, my day job, I'm a naturopathic author and consultant. I wrote the book Fix Your Gut, and I've always been interested in conspiracy ever since Alex Jones woke me up way back in 2009. Of course, I don't trust anything Alex Jones says now. But yeah, I came across the Finders myself about year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when I was researching the Council for National Policy. And I noticed that a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff going around about the Finders that some of it was unsubstantiated, some of it is substantiated. And so I just started really looking into it and seeing, if I could find all the newspaper clips and, see if I can find the old, the customs report, to read that. And then later I found the Tallahassee police report documents that someone had gotten through the Freedom of Information Act, and then found the FBI documents that somebody had gotten from the Freedom of Information Act. And then later I found out that it linked to the Glendale Montessori School case, James Toward, in the 80s, that had researched and also had just many, many links that we're going to talk about when we talk about the Finders and Marion Petty's very interesting life over the years. But yeah, to start with what most people know that was reported in the news. And on February 4, 1987, a concerned citizen notified the Tallahassee Police Department that he had observed 6 children playing in Myers Park. The children, of course, like you mentioned earlier, were poorly dressed. They were bruised, they were dirty, and they were behaving like wild animals. And they were accompanied by 2 well-dressed men. Of course, many of the Finders men, they always wore suits. And Toby Terrell mentions in his book, as so does Jordan Arico, one of the little girls that we talk about later, that the Finders women would doll themselves up for professional jobs as well. So they would wear, very nice clothing, but their children would not. They would wear hand-me-downs and look like wild animals. So both Douglas Edward Ammerman, who was 27 at the time, and Michael James Hallwell, who went by the alias Houlihan, was 28. They both claimed that they were teachers, and they were en route to a school for brilliant children in Mexico. The mothers of the children had later stated that they were unaware that the children might be taken to school, that they were going to be taken to the school in Mexico, though. So when both Hallowell and Ammerman were arrested, they became extremely evasive. And Hallowell refused to talk. He fainted. They were just acting very theatrical. Now, supposedly there was a video out there, which Derek Brose talked about in his documentary. There's also police reports that it was filmed, but I have not seen said video. Gotcha. So if anybody has that video or knows the gentleman that has filmed it, I would love to see it.
Right.
But yeah, they had multiple aliases. We'll talk about what they found in the 1979 Dodge Sportsman blue van that had Virginia plates that they were traveling the kids in this kind of broken down, kind of, shaggy van. And so the children that were found, there were 6 of them. There was Max Livingstone, who was a male. He was age of 6. Galen Ben Knopf, he was 4. James Michael Hollowell III, who was 2 years old. Honeybee Evans, who was 3 years old. B.B. Said, who was 3 years old. And Jordan Messino Arico, who was the oldest girl. She was 6 years old. So yeah, they were, Ammerman and Hallowell were traveling around. They claimed that they were going to some school in Mexico, which the investigative journalist Charles Soka said they were going down to, what was there was a Jesuit priest that had a school down in Mexico. I think it was called like CCDOC, that they were traveling. Supposedly that's where they were going to travel to. Evian Illich was his name. He was very popular in modernizing a lot of homeschooling that we have today. That the Council for National Policy is very big, and that was supposedly the school that they were going to, allegedly.
Gotcha.
But I was not able to verify that though, outside of what Soko had claimed. Do you want to go through a few of the curious things that were found in the van?
Yes,
that
absolutely.
Were
Very strange. Yes.
Police report. There was, a bunch of food. The kids and most of the finders were pretty much vegetarians for the most part. A whole bunch of dirty clothes, stuff that you expect people traveling in a van would have. But they also had some weird things too, like a brown bag containing 20 floppy disks. They're program disks. They were not databases. Radio Shack calculator, Radio Shack TRS-80 computer with keyboard, battery operated spotlight, Chinese English dictionary. Douglas and Michael's passports, brand canvas bag containing some nude photos of children, Trojan condoms, a piece of paper titled The Ballad of Ballads was found in the van that referenced the Washington, D.C. warehouse of the finders, a house in the mountains, Miami, Hawaii, San Diego, and China, which were all locations that the finders were known to go to. So yeah, there was really weird things that were found in the van. Of course, later when we talk about how everybody says that the finder's case was a witch hunt, and that the children were taken care of, and there was maybe if you look at the customs report, some people say that Ramon J. Martinez's customs report is outlandish and a lot of its claims. The Tallahassee police report, which is about the closest that you're going to get to being on the ground, the closest that you're going to get to the truth, they mentioned that there were new photos of children in a brown paper bag.
Gotcha.
So remember, or brown canvas bag, I should say. So remember that.
Right.
That's weird.
Right. So it set off an investigation. Once this was discovered, it became a larger issue because there was multi-state involvement. This guy from the Customs Department, USCS, Ramon Martinez, got involved and started the tendrils of the relationship between these guys and the finders started being investigated, going to D.C. and Virginia, correct?
Yes, and also curious enough, too, is apparently there was a second van that no one has talked about, to my knowledge, because they found a second TRS-80 computer that was located in a phone booth on the Florida State University campus by Tallahassee Police, employee and communications section Robert J. Sorkine. He was a student, and he gave it, I think, to the Tallahassee Police. Tallahassee Police Department officer Rick Huffman thought that there was a second group. A message was found on the computer from finders member Stuart Silverstone that warning them about that had been found. And there was a witness later on who had mentioned that they had saw a second van, which is interesting because if you read Toby Terrell's book and you read the police accounts, there were 8 children in the finders. One was a boy, I believe, named Walker, and that might have been his alias, who was also a member of the finders who was not on this trip, supposedly. But was he in that other van? Were there any other children who were outside of the finders that were in said second van? I do not know, but I do find that extremely interesting. And they tried to track down that second van and any leads, but again, as we talk about later, the case was shut down.
Right. So but let's get to the point where so there's all these kind of at that time that was kind of relatively recent tech, the TRS-80,
Yes.
1987. But there was an investigation that went to Madison County, Virginia, and there were warrants to raid other properties where there were found some very interesting materials that were similar to what was found in the van, correct?
Yeah, when we get to the warehouse raid, which is the DC, which is kind of separate from this, yes, there were. That was where you get the general information from the customs report, which
Gotcha.
is I mean, none of the people don't realize too that the children were taken to a safe house known as the Tree House, and there was a bomb threat called on the Tree House on February 7th, 1987, according to the Tallahassee police report. And the children were located by the sheriff's department because of that bomb threat. So why would the finders, if they were such an innocent organization, call it a bomb threat? I mean, maybe they didn't, but William, no one's ever reported. I didn't hear Bros talk about. I don't remember. Did Bros talk about that in his documentary?
No,
I don't think he did.
No.
And I found that extremely interesting. So yeah, I mean, Jane. Of course, Bros did talk about this. Jane Patella of Florida HRS and Dr. Moore did examine the children for potential abuse. They made a statement that Jordan and Mac's examination findings were consistent with sexual abuse. John Paul had many old bruises and bite marks, and the bite marks appeared to be human. Dr. Moore mentioned that Mac's links lacked anal sphincter control consistent with previous sodomy. Now, again, that could have been just because of their diet, just to put it out there. He didn't mention the anal tearing or anal bruising or anything like that you see in a lot of molestation cases. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't going on. It's just that there wasn't. With McMartin, you had a little bit of stronger physiological anatomy evidence.
Right.
In this case, it's not as strong. Just like they mentioned that Jordan, her right hymen was absent, but they did mention that she had an enlarged vaginal orifice, which is consistent with digital penetration. Of course, the mothers of the children denied that any sexual abuse has ever gone on. Toby Terrell denied it, and Michael Hollowell, who had been arrested, who was the father of Jordan Messino Arco, may have been the father, or at least the adopted father, and the father of James Michael Hollowell III, who was known as John Paul Pope. They, claimed that nothing like that had gone on.
Where were the mothers at the time that these kids were found in?
The fathers were. We'll talk about that too. The fathers of the fighters cult were who took care of the children after about the age of 3. Mm-hmm. The mothers would be sent off to the warehouse in San Francisco to do like work in offices and write articles and stuff like that, and be editors and stuff. So they'd be separate away from the children completely, and would not see them very often at that age.
Interesting.
Now you're going to find this really interesting with your knowledge of a lot of the quote-unquote satanic panic cases, sexual abuse cases in the 1980s that everybody liked to say are satanic panic, but we know that they're not. There's a lot of evidence at the bare minimum that child abuse had occurred. At the most, it was ritual satanic abuse, which I believe was the case. If anybody hasn't read the book, The Witch Hunt Narrative by Rossi Chet, I'd recommend reading that book. It's a very, very, very lengthy book to reference the truth in a lot of these cases when it comes to molestation. But Dr. Naaman H. Greenberg, he was flown in from the Chicago area to interview the children to see if they had been sexually abused. Naaman Greenberg charged the Florida the Resource Center $168,000, was offered 9 contracts for his work on the Finders case for consulting to improve Florida's response and training to handle sexual abuse after the Finders case. Mm-hmm. Of course, HRS Secretary Gregory Kohler, who also knew Greenberg back in Chicago, he came under a lot of fire for that. Now, very interesting enough, if it was, Naaman H. Greenberg had been part of the Finders cult investigation to determine whether or not the children had been abused, you kind of just overlook that. But when he was the champion for the defense for the McMartin preschool case.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. So he shows up in this case and then McMartin.
It was later also part of the Jewish Community Center case. in 1984.
Which one was that? I don't recollect.
The VCC, the Jewish Community Center, the molestations had occurred there too as well. It's very, very longly detailed in Rossi Chet's books that it had occurred. Molestation at least had occurred, but there were apparently implications too of satanic ritual abuse in the JCC as well.
Interesting.
But yes, so of course, Greenberg tanks the Jewish Community Center case, helps to really try to put a strain on McFarland's credibility. Key McFarland, who was the therapist who was going through the kids at McMartin, kind of try to really make, even though Ray Buckey was convicted, but later, it was reversed.
Right. I think the case was thrown out and then they retried him, right?
That's right. Yeah, you're right. He was involved in that, and he was involved in the Jewish Community Center case, so he helped get that done as well. He also helped, it was finally, and Dr. Greenberg's conclusion, that there was no abuse was found in the Finders case in Tallahassee, Florida.
Gotcha. So, yeah, but I mean, it's interesting to bring him into this conversation because it shows the Finders were part of this whole child abuse phenomenon that really peaked right around that time, 1980s.
And I have no idea why no one ever's mentioned that. No one, to my knowledge. And it's in the Tallahassee police report that they referenced Dr. Naaman Inch Greenberg. It's in multiple articles from the Tallahassee paper. Yeah. But yet no one ever looked into him. And I mean, it's odd. It is. I mean, especially when you connect him being part of all three things, and and then him, he also founded a Causes Child Abuse Unit for Studies, Education, and Services at the Illinois Masonic Hospital back in 1975 at that time. So he was looked at as an expert for all these cases in a lot of ways.
Right. Interesting. Really fascinating. So, and then, I mean, there's evidence these kids they're not from Florida, right? Are they from Virginia?
No, they were not. They lived, all the kids were, at least these kids, we don't know about any other kids. These kids were members of the Finders, technically. Their parents were in the Finders. They lived in an area called Paradise that was near the Free area. It was in Virginia that Petty had owned. It was kind of near the city, or I guess town, Nethers, Virginia. And the kids lived in this area called Paradise. And so you read a lot about in the Tallahassee police report about how the kids were taken care of, and how, like you mentioned earlier, they didn't know what simple appliances were, and that they were fed really poor vegetarian meals, and Toby Terrell writes it in his book that the kids are like, well, it's a new type of parenting that we were doing, and lauds about how important it was and everything. But the kids pretty much, they lived out in the wild while the parents lived in cabins on these properties, and some of the cabins were ran down, or Petty lived in quote unquote the red cabin, which was nice, or they lived in the warehouse, which was nice back in DC, and they pretty much let the kids, the parents didn't really talk to the kids. They let, they would get down on their knees to interact with the children, and they wore special knee pads because of it. Mary Ann Petty never really met the children except for one time where Ronald Allman, who was mentioned in the report by Jordan Arico, that she would take him down to like the basement because you hear a lot about basements when it comes to a lot of the satanic ritual abuse, whether it's McMartin Preschool or even in this case the Finders. And it seems to be that the Tallahassee Police Department and the DC Metro Police, they were trying to figure out what about these basements? Why would they take the kids down to these basements? What about the basements? And Jordan did not want to talk about it. She didn't want to talk about the basements. She didn't want to talk about Ronald Allman very much. His nickname was Lucky. He was ex-Green Beret. They didn't want to talk about him. So the first time they met Petty, they Ronald Allman put all these candles out around this area that was near, making a little island around this near this miniature lake. Okay, so they met him as a god figure, And Jordan Arico talks about him in that reference and how he's the game caller and how he's like seems to be the boss and they don't really see him, So it's weird how the fighters, they're all like, it's this weird way they took care of the children. It's not normal.
Not normal, but it's also kind of classic cult behavior where you remove the kids from their parents, and have
they weaned them from their mothers. Because Toby Terrell talks about it in his book that they weaned it was two of the children. I think it was Honeybee and Ben Knopf. Weaned them too early, and they would cry for their mothers, just cry for them. But yet they just thought it was that the mothers had to go work over there in San Francisco or whatever, and so they weaned them at the age of around the age of 2, which with breastfeeding sometimes moderately that's normal, but to keep them completely away from their mothers though, that's not normal.
Very odd. So I mean the investigation, after it completes in Tallahassee, it moves to D.C. and Virginia.
Well, it was going on at the same time.
Okay.
It was going on at the same time. I believe that the Tallahassee Police Department and the D.C. Metro Police did their best. I believe that it was shut down, and we'll talk about why, by the FBI, and later when it was reopened, was shut down by the CIA, when it was reopened by the State Department. And I do think that, again, now, we haven't seen you might find interesting. We haven't found the DC Metro, been able to get a hold of the DC Metro police files, William, because they are classified secret.
It's amazing that they're even classified. So that's evidence or an indicator that something regarding state involvement is happening.
So the DC Metro Police were classified secret report. So I really want to know what's in those reports because the DC police, they thought they were investigating the fighters even beforehand. They were investigating. They were shooting pornography at the warehouse. Right. One of the detectives thought they were shooting child pornography at the warehouse, allegedly. I mean, they were being investigated long before the Tallahassee incident.
Right, but the thing is that what happened in Madison County? So even outside of D.C., there was evidence of a satanic ritual. There were pictures of kids and the ritual
about
slaughter
the execution of Henrietta and Igor, the goats.
Right, correct, and they found child pornography. So. This is, there's a consistent element of illegality in in this child porn going on. And it reminded me, the blood ritual, like the kids are involved in slaughtering goats. And it was actually admitted by Toby Terrell that it happened. But he kind of...
Yes, but he says it was a way to teach them hands-on natural butchering that would have been done 125, 200 years ago, which is all fine and dandy.
Yeah. That's a nice spin. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's the thing is look, I get it that, I try to be objective as much as I possibly can, William. I really do, but it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult in this case. Once you see all the connections, and I'm still not done yet finding them the slightest bit, of who the finders were, it's almost impossible to take almost anything that they say a basic narrative at face value.
Right. I totally agree with that. How did they got their name? Can you describe how they got this term? They really didn't have a public, associated name like Scientology or anything. They just became it because of their central figure, Marion Petty, and what he talked about what they did, right?
Yeah, I mean, they would just find information.
So they were part of a network. Yeah, they were part of a network, and they would do weird things to get information. They would go on to newspapers and be, advertised for babysitting and all kinds of stuff, and just gather information on people.
And they would, and of course, Marianne Petty's wife, Isabel Petty, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Right. His son worked for, was it David Petty? He worked for Air America. I can't remember if it's David Petty or George Petty that worked for Air America. I think it was David Petty that worked for Air America. But yeah, the Air America, of course, it's just he was so just entranced with the intelligence organization, and then for Toby Terrell in his book to be like, Petty wasn't part of it, and then for the investigator that leaked out the investigated leads memo. I want to get his name right real quick. He was Ed and I talked about him on the Opperman podcast. Daniel Brandt. He started Namebase, which is a web-based cross-index database of names and stuff like that for the intelligence agency and stuff. He was pretty much like Wendell Minnick, like everybody but me and Charles Soka, which Charles Soka is now pretty much being like there's something wrong. And he actually knew the finders. I mean, he dated Dave Petty's ex-wife. Like he was part of the finders to some degree and in relations with them, but he couldn't stand them. He's kind of changed. He's kind of changed his mind before, where he was like, "There's maybe something here." To there seems more and more like there's something here with the information I'm giving him.
Can you just a sec? Can you explain who Wendell Minnick was, please?
He was an author who wrote an encyclopedia on spies, and I want to get a copy of it. I cannot think of the name specifically.
Spies and Provocateurs.
Yeah, Spies and Provocateurs. Do you have a copy of it?
No.
Okay. I want to get one for $10. But yes, he investigated the finders in the mid-'90s and published an article, "The Finders, the CIA, and the Cult of Mary and David Petty." He claimed, again, that they were up to no good with their CIA connections, but everything else as far as satanic panic, like in that or satanic ritual abuse, should I say, in that regard, he kind of played the narrative of the satanic panic and said the satanic abuse didn't happen. And that's the same thing with Daniel Brandt. It's like, okay, like I've done so much research on this case that there's in my mind, there's about 99% chance that majority of the things that were in Ramon J. Martinez's customs report were true.
True, right. Even
though Ramon J. Martinez, I mean, there's some things that are questionable in his background as well, but I do think, that he was in his partner, Bob Harold, he became a truther. I don't know. It's, when you look at, so there was a woman, her name was Athena Varionis. She worked for the FBI. She was the inspiration for Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. Mm-hmm. She was the FBI agent that handled the Finders case and pretty much was like, "I'll take care of you." And Toby Terrell calls her, his goddess Athena in his book, The Game Caller.
Gotcha.
And she was the first FBI liaison for NCMEC.
What's NCMEC?
National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Gotcha. Which
I've done a lot of research in NCMEC, and they are extremely, very, very, very shady.
Okay.
I will go into that on my own podcast. We've read the documents because it would take me an hour to explain why NCMEC is shady. But once you start looking into it, then their connections with the United States government, they get funding for the government and everything.
Right.
And their connections to Microsoft and Microsoft DNA to look at, they pretty much house a lot of the child pornography that they found in the net, and they catalog it using Microsoft DNA. But who's watching the Watchers, William?
Good question. Well, I can going back to Ramon Martinez. He believed in his information so much that he sent it to Congress. So he was trying to find an end around after this whole investigation got shut down and stalled.
The more I've done the research in this case, the more I respect Ramon J. Martinez.
Yeah, he was really
I really
to try to get it out. Yeah,
and I do think that, and the thing is Athena, she claims that Ramon faked all that because he was jealous of her because he's a sexist.
Oh, that's a good one. That sounds actually very very like a recent type of excuse. It sounds like she might have been the inventor of that. The reality is that he came upon it independently. He was brought in because they were multi-jurisdiction. So I think he was right there at the beginning. So it's kind of silly that.
But then again, like they always say, no one corroborates Ramon J. Martinez's memo. Right, none of the DC officers, none of the FBI agents that were involved, no one that was involved corroborates it but him.
But the other materials that was found in Madison does corroborate the certain factual relationship.
Well, I can corroborate most of what Ramon J. Martinez said, just based off my knowledge of the finders and their, and for example, he talks about Stuart Miles Silverstone being at the apartment, and he was part of the finders. And I mean, the more I've done research on this, the more I believe that a majority of the customs document, because that's the thing is, I went into this saying, what can I verify, William?
Right.
And any good investigator could do that. You can't take anything at face value, even if it. Trust me, I want to believe almost everything that I uncovered is true, but you still have to look at it objectively and say, well, does this match up with this? Does this match up with this?
Right.
The more I've done research, the more I can conclude that the customs report of Ramon J. Martinez was accurate.
Gotcha.
And what they found at the warehouse, as far as alleged possible child pornography, filming of child pornography, which the D.C. Metro Police thought that they were doing, telexes of children to the Chinese embassy in Hong Kong, which, by the way, when the case was reopened by the State Department in the early 90s, because Skip Clemens got involved, and we'll talk about Skip Clemens, hopefully.
Okay.
They were investigating the finders for white slave trafficking.
Right, and
that's what it says on the released documents.
Right, there were documents. They were in communication using kind of really beginning, telex type things. But some of the
closed
notes,
message boards similar to one Hillary Rodham Clinton, huh?
Like
a closed system that they were dialing into.
Yeah, it was a dial-in system pre-internet, but they were sending stuff about, we're going to pick up the kids. I think there was an order for kids from China, right? Yeah,
there was. That was found in the warehouse, the customs report. Yes, and again, the area that the warehouse was in, it was 4 miles away from the Sheridan Calorama neighborhood where Craig Spence, the DC Madam, right. I guess not DC Madam, I guess Harry Vinson was the DC Madam, but Craig Spence was running, above him, a step above Harry Vinson. Right. But yeah, so it was in that general area. It's like it's weird. It's all in the general area, like the houses, the finders' houses are all in the general area of where, they claimed with Pizzagate, and I have, I do believe that there is some truth at Pizzagate. There are some falsities too. It was put out by Roger Stone and the Council for National Policy. A lot of it, it's kind of to throw shade. They couldn't, neither Clinton or Trump could go with Epstein, So they kind of
right. Good point. They did not bring him up during the election.
So instead, they were like, "Let's go with WikiLeaks and let's release, the information. Look at this. Don't look at what we've done. Look at this."
Well,
okay, not to say there isn't truth in it.
This is true. Pizzagate came out of WikiLeaks. It was WikiLeaks and the Podesta emails.
And there's supposedly involvement with Roger Stone in as well, which was reported years ago by, I can't think of the name of the investigative journalist, Yoshi Shiramatsu.
Yes.
And and as much as I want to say that's fake, as much as I've looked into it, it appears to be correct.
Correct, right. Well,
not to say there isn't truth in it. Again, it's just, here's a lot of truth. Here's a few lies to get you stuck on. And, don't look at us, look at this.
Well, the Pizzagate was never, just like the finders, never properly investigated by the authorities. No. Not at all. But inside of Podesta's emails, there are all of these connections between him and his brother and Alephantis
and the art.
And the art.
The connection to the Lozado farm and the
Antonis,
Lozado children.
Right. Antonis, the emails that said, I have a map with a handkerchief on top of checkerboards, all the coded language.
Can I disprove one email, though, while I'm here in my own research, while we're talking about it?
Sure.
The walnut sauce. I really honestly believe that John Podesta was talking about pasta because there is a walnut sauce, and it's, it's an Italian walnut sauce, pasta sauce. You can look it up yourself.
That might be fair, but the preponderance of pizza references.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. It's just the walnut sauce is one of the only things where I think people got too much of a lead on. That's all.
That might be fair. Well, thank God people got that wrong. That means they're probably not pedophiles because it sounded like coded language. And
I know. I do think that Podesta and his brother are more than likely alleged pedophiles, and Alefantis and this was going on. But just that specific email, there is a walnut pasta sauce. It's very well known.
Yeah, but that doesn't disprove anything else that was in there.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all.
They are contact. The Podesta brothers are in contact with Hastert, crossing party lines.
Yeah. Yeah,
these are very serious things that were never properly laid out. And
not
only
at all.
people can. And the fact that Roger Stone and Jerry Corsi and all these other people were waiting on the WikiLeaks emails that were probably stolen by Seth Rich, not leaked, and they're still repeating that lie that they were actually hacked by Russia, which is there's actually no evidence for that.
Well, I mean, it was through a phishing scam. Possess's password was runner1234, if I remember correctly.
Well, that might be it. But my understanding is that Seth Rich is involved in this, but they're never. I mean, in the whole thing with the Abramovich and the blood rituals and all that stuff, those guys were interested, but everybody else on Earth was interested in the WikiLeaks leaks, and they were signaled by Julian Assange before the 2016 election. So to say that these guys and implicate these two guys in some type of Russian leak is just a total farce and a fraud.
But I do think it was put on to discredit Hillary Clinton. Of course, she deserves it, but in a way that did not discredit Trump.
No doubt. I don't think there's any doubt. They were hammering the WikiLeaks revelations 2 or 3 days before the election on InfoWars with Roger Stone. Every right-wing asset was promoting and bullhorning all of that dark stuff, the spirit cooking and all this crap like that. So
and also one last thing, you've seen Podesta do that, have like the scars on his hands.
Absolutely.
In his emails, I can't remember the exact medical condition, and I will get back to you with it. Podesta referenced that he has a medical condition where his hands are contracture that would require surgery to give those exact scars on his hands.
Interesting.
That is another form of misinformation. Through my own research that I've determined. It's in the WikiLeaks emails that he has this medical condition and that he was getting surgery for it. And those scars would be exactly where he got the surgery.
You know that his nickname is Skippy and that he used to work on a farm where he would take pigs and cut them in half.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yep.
So,
I mean, look, I'm not saying that Pizzagate is not real. I'm not saying that James Alefonsis. I'm just saying that, there is some parts of it, just like everything. I might get things about the Finders case wrong. Okay, but there's certain things that are constantly put out there in the ether that through my own research, I'm not, people are sitting there and saying I'm a Pizzagate denialist now, which is farther from the truth.
These are just ridiculous labels that don't have any meaning.
Yeah, but all right, so let's get back to the Finders. The warehouse itself, like you'd mentioned, I mean, they had files of information of different places. They eventually found passports to North Korea, for example.
Wow, that's amazing.
Why would they have access to North Korea in the late 90s? Vietnam, So it's just crazy,
Super sketchy stuff going back, and it all leads back to the central character of the Finders, Marion Buford Petty, and who also known as the Game Caller.
Yes, because he would call games. It was just kind of like the Mad Hatter, where he'd be like, just go somewhere, drop everything you know and just go somewhere, or go to China, or go to Colorado, or go to Hawaii and try to survive there, and don't come back till you make $100.
Right, yeah. That's what Terrell said in his interview was he.
That's what he said in his book too.
Okay. So, and let's talk about Marion Petty and how his background and how he went from the military as a so-called chauffeur, which is probably a cover, to infiltrating kind of the nascent countercultural movement.
Well, most of that information we have comes from Toby Terrell's book, The Game Caller, and from an investigative leads memo, which I've verified to seem, pretty much true. And then again, also Daniel Brandt also said it seemed to be true as well, as much as you could trust Daniel Brandt. But it does seem to be correct in that, Petty had connections to the OSS. A lot of, Petty said himself that a lot of OSS officers would go live in the apartments that he had during World War II. They come, so yeah, it's just all his connections that he has with OSS. And then, he was a chauffeur for, many different generals, Ira Aker. He was for many different presidents before they were president, like Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Toby Terrell talked a lot about that in his book, and it was also in the investigative leads memo too as well. So he was, when he was a chauffeur, he was driving around very, very important people. Right. And so now Petty claims that he got his money from being really, really good at card games.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And he just saved his money and was able to buy vast amounts of land in the Virginia area and property.
Yeah, like 600 acres and houses and stuff.
I think it's bullcrap.
Right, like everything else, there's a cover story. That's all the elements of an intel op is just mythical rationales for everything, and you put them all together, and they're all just transparent.
I mean,
that makes sense.
Toby Terrell says that he was just able to save his money. He just saved his money and played card games and
I just made a lot of money when I was young, and next thing you know, I'm supporting this cult. Yeah.
I mean, but again, in the investigated leads, it talks about that he gotten his money from, pretty much people that were within this network, to be able to buy those properties. So, and I think it was Charles E. Marsh who had ended up giving him money for it. And so, so he started buying, the fighters group started buying all these properties, like that's, properties in Virginia, near Nethers, Virginia. He called the Free State, where all these hippies went to, and would set out their own properties. And Petty put cabins up there, and later, the finders kids would stay in that general area. They bought 2 warehouses that we know of, one in San Francisco, and one in the W warehouse in Washington, D.C. that was raided. Multiple properties, the W Street apartments. Just so many, he held so many, and a lot of that property was bought by Toby Terrell for the Finders Group. Which Toby Terrell himself, was a former IRS agent. So Petty was involved with, who do you want to talk? Timothy Leary.
Let's talk about his involvement with Timothy Leary. He was part of the human potential movement, which I think Leary was part of, Huxley was part of. Yep. All these kind of bigwigs.
Timothy Leary said that he met. Marion Petty said that he met Timothy Leary. There was a guy who was connected to Timothy Leary that Toby Terrell talks in his book that he one of Petty's houses burned down, but he doesn't say who or why it was. But Petty actually talks about in an interview that he did with Ken Thomas and Lynn Bracken that it was burned up during an LSD trip with this kid that was connected to Timothy Leary. So and then you are also probably aware of who was the pilot? Oh, that was associated with Leary.
The pilot.
He was supposedly, according to the investigated leads memo, he was he knew Petty as well. I can't think of his name.
Are you talking about Fletcher Prouty?
No, it wasn't Fletcher Prouty. It was some other. I can't think of it. But yeah,
Barry Seal? Barry Seal? No.
No, it wasn't Barry Seal. That was drug running later on.
I don't know which pilot you're talking about. And where was the pilot? What was his related? What was he notorious for? He
was Timothy Leary's pilot.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I don't even know who his pilot was.
But he was apparently possibly running psychedelics and stuff.
Oh, well, I wouldn't be surprised. Leary provided...
He's someone famous. As soon as I say his name, you'd be like, yeah, you should know who he is. But I cannot think of him for the life of me. But yeah, it's just... With all the connections that Leary had to all these people, and into the OSS, into the CIA, and all these intelligence officers, and it was Walt Snyder. He was Timothy Leary and Billy Hitchcock's private pilot.
Right, and Hitchcock was Mellon family. What was the place that they had up in the Millbrook, right? Millbrook Estate?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So, being a part with all this group and being a part of, he was, no one, I don't have no idea also why Derek Bronze didn't bring it up in his movie, but Marion Petty was very, very, very good friends with Patch Adams.
Interesting.
And Patch Adams went to him to get his money to build the Gesundheit Institute, his children's hospital, which Marianne Petty had turned down. So yeah, Who is Petty not involved with?
Right. Well, that's the odd thing. And the other thing is that he's very much cloak and dagger. There's very few pictures of him with all these important people that he knew.
Yeah, there's hardly any pictures of him, period.
Right. So with that in itself is sketchy. And he also like walked that 10 or 20 miles a day. Just very odd. And a lot of,
he would just take flights as a former Army officer out of Andrews Air Force Base and go wherever he wants to go.
Yeah, just disappear, show up. Yeah, very strange.
I mean, he was connected also to Roy Mason, who was an architect who was part of the World Future Society, which, of course, World Future Society includes Buckminster Fuller, who's a famous architect, and Gene Roddenberry, and Ray Kurzweil, and Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson. So anyway, Mason got his degree at architecture at Yale University. It was called the Mad Foamer because he would spray a Eurofoam foam everywhere and make these like geodesic domes and stuff. And Charles Soker, the investigative reporter, he talked about how Mason, pretty much he was a pedophile allegedly. And Toby Terrell talks about in his book about how he was dating a transsexual who dropped a cigarette in one of Mason's garbage cans and burned down his house by accident.
Hey.
But yeah, Mason actually worked for the Washington, D.C. Children's Museum.
Oh, yipes.
So, yeah, I mean, what about given someone recently, Theodore Gerald Rest, he was part of the Finders. He taught at Georgetown University. Of course, Georgetown University wiped his webpage biography because he was allegedly sentenced on Wednesday, May 10th, 2017 for distribution of child pornography over a peer-to-peer network. He had 291 videos and 29 still images.
Yipes. I mean, it's just like all these crazy connections and stuff like that. And a lot of the similar themes keep popping up, right?
Yeah, I mean, one time you might this will go back to because you recently interviewed Roberta Glass and her excellent information. It was a great interview. If anybody listening, you go to listen to it on Dershowitz's case.
Right.
But in Pittsburgh during 1975, Toby Terrell went to Pittsburgh and he met Keith Ham, who was part of this new Vrindavan Hare Krishna community. Well, a lot of them were implicated in racketeering, but they were also implicated in allegedly child molestation, which eventually Keith Ham was convicted for. Now, Terry Sheldon, which was part of this group, he was represented by Scientologist Greta Van Susteren, who later represented Harry Vinson and who sold him out, the D.C. Madam. But funny in quotation marks enough, Keith Ham was represented by Alan Morton Dershowitz, who was paid $3 million for his services, who got everything, all the racketeering charges, convictions returned, and saying that the child molesting evidence had been unfairly prejudiced the jury against Keith Ham.
Wow, that's amazing. Of
course, Keith Ham was later charged and sent to prison
for something else, but we were talking about that last night. We were saying Alan Dershowitz has a history of representing some very unsavory people, including...
That's why I wanted to bring that up.
Right. So now you can just add to the list Klaus von Bülow, OJ,
Keith Ham,
Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, holy smoke.
It never ends.
Yeah,
it never ends.
And Dershowitz he's like 80 years old, so he's had decades to get involved in all types of different, very curious cases, shall we say.
Yeah, don't even get me started on Dershowitz. But I mean, so two more things real quick on the Finders.
Okay.
James F. Hollowell, who was Michael Hallowell's father, he was in the Finders as early as 1970s. He eventually left the Finders. He was part of Jim Fetzer's Scholars for 9/11 Truth. He was associated member.
Interesting. So this is the guy, the original person who was pulled over by police in Tallahassee.
No. That was his father.
That was his father. So the son of the original person who was arrested is
Yes.
now associated with Fetzer. Gotcha.
No. The father was. He passed away. The father of Michael Hallowell, who's arrested.
Gotcha.
Michael Hallowell's son was arrested.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand. So he was actually fairly old when he was associated with Fetzer then, huh?
Yes, he recently passed away. I mean, thing about Hollowell is he seemed like, I know he's part of the Finders and he was probably sketchy, okay, but he seemed like, when I looked at his Facebook page, I looked at his Twitter, he seemed like an old man that taught a lot of inner city people chess who were very grateful of him. And he's one of the few Finders that was pro-Trump and a conspiracy theorist. The rest of them are extremely left-leaning liberals.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't know anything about James Howell. I'm not going to make any accusations other than that he was part of the Finders and his son was later, of course. Michael Hollowell was pulled over in Tallahassee. And I'm not, and I'm not going to say that everybody who was in the Finders or everybody who the Finders had ever came in contact with, knew any of these organizations are extremely compartmentalized.
Right.
I mean, you should know.
Right.
William.
Absolutely. Well, these guys were intelligent. The Finders were intelligent people. Petty was not a slouch. I mean, he was just like any other cult leader. He never really had a job. I think he said to journalists, "Not unless you call being a cult leader full-time employment. I haven't had any." So he was probably just living off at least the pension. Where's all this money coming from? So he's got surreptitious money supposedly from playing cards. Give me a break.
I mean, they had relationships with the Moonies. They ran a gala for the Moonies at one time. The Finders did. They met them and met Reverend Sung Young Moon and they had many shell companies. Future Enterprises, which is a computer trading company that trades CIA employees. Gung Ho Traders, which again Finders connections with China and their alleged child trafficking connections with China too. They had this Gung Ho Trader company where there was like an import-export where Toby Terrell talks about his book, The Game Caller, about how when they first went to San Francisco and got the warehouse that they got a whole bunch of stuff from Chinatown that people were just throwing away and they may have ended up selling that. So they had a lot of shell companies, tons and tons of shell companies.
Classic cult-type stuff. Scientology is the same way. And same with the Moonies. Yeah, tons of different...
of course, the Moonies were connected to the Council for National Policy. The Republicans love the Moonies.
Love it. They're good donors, It's good donors.
Now, one last Finder person I want to talk about, I want to see if I can find him, was, what was his name was, I think his name was Rios. He was really big in polyamory.
And he was a member of the Finders?
Yes, he was. I cannot. Well, let me see if I can find it. He was he's very, very sketchy. And his. Okay, I found him. His name was Michael Versance Rios. He was the son of the United States Army Colonel Humpart Joseph Versance. His mother was the author of The 15th Pelican, Terry Rios, who became which later became the television show The Flying Nun. So he, while in high school, founded a polyamory commune known as the Community in the mid-1960s. It lasted for 30 years. He co-founded several alternative schools and education programs in early 1970s. And had the first domestic violence hotline in the United States. He also started a lot of computer retail stores and sold computers during the late 70s, which is early time for that.
Very early, absolutely.
In the early 1980s, he founded a social service agency and personally took in over 100 teenage foster children. I'm looking into that currently. He runs this intentional village now called the Allegheny Crest Intentional Village, and this thing called Center for New Culture, and it's just nothing about polyamory, which, if you're adults and you're a libertine, fine. I think it's kind of degenerate as a Christian, but,
it sounds like he's staying in the same vein he was in the Finders, right? Probably corrupting people, getting information. What do you think the full purpose of the Finders was?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can speculate. I could say that they were a front for the global, at least one arm of the global cabal to gain information and to traffic children allegedly and sell child pornography allegedly and traffic information. I don't know about drugs, traffic goods. They were around a lot of the LSD people, the psychedelic movement, so I don't know. It's just, like I said, when I first started this, I went in objectively, and the more I've gotten now, at this point, it's if anyone ever tells you, even me, if I ever say I exactly understand the finders, then I've been bought out.
Right.
I can only go on the information that I know.
But the information is super sketchy. I mean, they basically were never prosecuted.
It is.
The FBI and the CIA squashed or quashed any kind of investigation.
I'm just saying I'll never get down to the bottom of it, William. I don't think it'll ever end.
Well, yeah. Well, Marion, the guy is dead, so there's no way you're going to find much about him. And they didn't seem to keep a lot of records, and the guys who are talking about it clearly aren't getting into the details of the organizational structure and controls.
Oh, I mean, what about Henry Tilden Skip Clements, who said that the finders were involved with the Glendale Montessori School abuse case in the 80s, and that Henry Skip Clements claimed that he worked for the CIA, and that many of his children were allegedly molested at the Glendale Montessori School in Stuart, Florida, and that the finders were a part of it. And he actually talks about the finders having Montessori schools in Kentucky, but that didn't later come out, and or at least it was. I mean, he may have been able to figure that out because it was in an obscure local newspaper that I read that talked about that. Like, he had to have been doing some deep research to figure that out. Of course, the two people that brought it up were, from my Fayetteville, North Carolina, Senator Charles Rose, who has many connections to the CMP and to Rackgate, and just was definitely not our guy. And Tom Lewis, who, when he retired the same time Charles Rose did, like after this case was brought to the State Department, and then they were like, we're not going to do anything about it. Right. The guy who replaced Tom Lewis was Mark Foley.
Right. Mark Foley,
who resigned later in the homosexual page scandal.
Right, page scandal. He was sending all those texts. At least that's what he probably was trying to do more than send the text, but whatever.
I will one day try to reach out to Henry Clements. I have found him.
Nice. And
try to see if I can get information on. I've also refound the Tallahassee Police Department PR guy. I can't remember his name at the time, and he worked at the Tallahassee Police Department for 20 years. But when I messaged him on LinkedIn, he did not get back to me.
Yeah, it's been 30 years. This is a very cold type of case. To get all the details out of there would probably be very difficult.
But I mean, like I said, when you look at everything connected, there definitely were things going on for sure.
Yeah, I would totally agree.
And one last thing, as much as I do appreciate Derek Brose's documentaries, it saddens me that he's bought into the whole satanic panic narrative. Yeah. He should, as much as research he's done with Jeffrey Epstein, he should know a little bit more than that.
Yeah. Well, some people get convinced by that. They think that it's a cover for child molestation. If you look at the Lanning report, that's the gist.
Yeah, but
no satanic crimes.
You know about the Lanning report really well. You've read it, right?
Absolutely. I did a whole show on the Lanning report.
I want to have you on my podcast after I do the Lanning report on refuting it with me, because it's
easily
ridiculous.
refutable. Yeah, it's a joke. He also sets up this very kind of supremely legalistic standard for what a occult influence crime is, that basically tantamount to, like, you got to have your nose held, standing on one leg, on a specific date in a specific time to have something influenced by the occult, and it's absurd. Yeah. So if you can't abide by his extremely elevated standard, then it's not a cult. So even though you could say, I'm doing this by the will of Satan, Lanning and the Lanning report standard would negate it. But the gist of his report is that the occult crimes is people attributing things that are really just child abuse, and I don't believe that at all. There's tons of occult-inspired criminals out there. There's just a horde of them.
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, and that was one thing that saddened me, that he used to term satanic panic, but didn't talk. Like Brose kind of just went limp-wristed. And then when I contacted Brose about a month or two before his documentary came out, and I was like, hey, I got information that you might find interesting, he kind of blew me off. And I was like, well, okay, fine, whatever. So
there's very disturbing aspects of this case. There's rural stuff, kids, goat slaughter, pictures. One thing you might find interesting is
people
there was something in there of people were in ritual outfits, right?
Well, yeah, and Stuart Silverstone and his girlfriend that were both in the Fighters Cult, they adored Aleister Crowley.
Interesting. How did you find out about that?
That's in Toby Terrell's book, The Game Caller.
That's interesting. Well, that's perfect. Then they were in the right cult. They probably, if they're in one of the cult like the Finders, if they really emulate Crowley, there's probably involved in 10 other cults as well.
Well, they say the execution of Henry and Igor, where the children were there. The report, they say they were wearing robes. Toby Terrell claims they were aprons to get their clothes from getting dirty. Sure. But the kids were there when they, pulled the placenta out of Henrietta, and look,
that's totally normal. That's totally normal, John. Just get a 3-year-old kid to watch a bloody slaughter of a goat. Yeah, sure.
But that's what they claim. That is what they claim, William.
It's absurd. Where can people find your stuff? Where can people go? You're on social media. You tell us where they can contact you if they have any other questions or want to follow up.
They can contact me at john@fixyourgut.com if they have any emails or anything that they want to send to me about this information. And they can find me at Fix Your Gut.
John@fixyourgut.com. FIXYOURGUT.com, correct?
Yes.
Gotcha. And do you have any other social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram?
Nah, I got a Facebook for Fix Your Gut. Nothing for the stuff that I'm doing now. Maybe in the future, we're doing a podcast called We Read the Documents. We've only recorded 3 episodes now. Right now, the first season is going to be on ritual satanic abuse and the history of it. So far, for the past 3 episodes, we did the ancient history of sacrifices of the Mesopotamic area and religion aspects and, ancient stuff. And now the next episode we're getting into is the Children of God cult, which my 3 main cases are the Children of God cult. Hopefully one day will be Little Rascals. And then the third is the Finders. So I've done a lot of extensive research on all 3 of those things.
That's a great idea, actually. You can actually read the documents, that's it.
Yeah.
If you want to cover West Memphis 3, you can go through the court cases and just
read that's why I wanted to have you on for West Memphis 3 as well.
Love to be on in a second.
But thank you for having me on, William. Again, I am a huge fan of your show.
Thanks,
and of course, the research that you've done on the West Memphis Free and the other research that you've done too as well should be applauded.
Well, I appreciate it.
But definitely thank you for having me on.
John, thanks so much. I appreciate it. John Brisson, and we discussed the cult, the Finders. Thank you so much. All right, cool, man.